German POW generals were shocked by their first sight of America. In the final, desperate months of World War II, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany, they captured dozens of high-ranking German generals. For these men, who had orchestrated a war that plunged Europe into darkness, their journey into captivity would become a journey into a world they couldn't have imagined. This is the story of their first shocking encounter with America. Imagine this: you're a German general. Your entire world, the one you fought to build, is literally smoldering ash. Cities you knew are now just rubble. The continent is a graveyard. You've been captured, and now you're being loaded onto a ship, the SS Duquesne, at the port of Le Havre in France. The port itself is a wreck, a testament to the destruction you've witnessed for years. You know you're heading west, across the Atlantic, to the enemy's homeland. What do you expect to find? More of the same, right? A nation strained by years of war, its resources depleted, its people weary. You believe America must be suffering, just like everyone else. As the ship pulls away from the skeletal remains of Le Havre, the generals look back at a Europe they had tried to conquer. Now it was a continent of ghosts. They were leaving behind years of constant bombing raids, of cities blacked out every night to hide from enemy planes, of rationing, hunger, and fear. This was their reality. War meant total devastation. As far as they were concerned, this was a universal truth. The journey across the Atlantic was fraught with a unique kind of terror for them. They weren't just prisoners. They were high-value targets. And the biggest threat wasn't from the Allies guarding them, but from their own side. The Atlantic was still prowled by German U-boats, and the standing order from their own high command was to sink any and all Allied shipping, no exceptions. A captured general later wrote in his diary about the irony. Every day they scanned the horizon, dreading the sight of a periscope. They were terrified of being sent to the bottom of the ocean by a torpedo fired from one of their own submarines. The U-boat crews would have no idea that they were sinking some of the Third Reich's most decorated military leaders. The generals performed lifeboat drills with their American captors, a bizarre scene of enemies united against a common, yet German, threat. This constant fear reinforced their belief that the war was everywhere, that no ocean was safe, and that destruction was the only rule. The Americans on board seemed relaxed, almost casual, which only confused the Germans more. Didn't they understand the danger they were in? After 12 days at sea, the tension finally broke. On the horizon, something impossible appeared. It started as a faint silhouette, a jagged line that didn't look natural. As they drew closer, it resolved into shapes, towering structures that reached for the clouds. It was the skyline of New York City. The generals, men who had seen the great capitals of Europe, simply could not process it. According to their own propaganda, and even their own military intelligence, New York should have been a smoking crater. German U-boats were supposed to have shelled it. The Luftwaffe was supposed to have launched long-range bombers to level it. They had been told for years that American cities were being systematically destroyed. But here it was, intact, gleaming, taller and more magnificent than anything they had ever seen. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, these weren't just buildings. They were symbols of a power and a prosperity that, from their perspective, shouldn't exist in a world at war. One general, Ferdinand Heim, who had commanded an entire army on the Eastern Front, just stared, mouth agape. He muttered to a fellow captive, "How can we win this war?" It wasn't a question of strategy anymore. It was a moment of profound, soul-crushing realization. They had been fighting a phantom. The America they thought they were crippling was a lie. The real America was right here, untouched and impossibly strong. The true shock, however, came after the sun went down. As the SS Duquesne sailed into New York Harbor at night, the city exploded into a universe of light. For years, the generals had lived in a world of total blackouts. Every city in Europe, from Berlin to London, was a black pit at night. A single lit window could bring a bomb whistling down from the sky. Light meant death. But here, in New York, the lights were on. Not just a few lights, but millions of them. Skyscrapers blazed with a brilliance that seemed defiant. Car headlights streamed through the streets like rivers of gold. Neon signs advertised everything from Coca-Cola to Broadway shows. To the German generals, this was the ultimate display of power. It was a spectacle of waste, of energy being casually thrown away on a scale they couldn't fathom. It wasn't just that America could afford to do this. It was that America wasn't afraid. They didn't need blackouts. The war, for all its fury, had not truly reached their shores. One general was heard saying, "This is a new Rome." They understood in that moment that they hadn't been fighting a nation. They had been fighting a different civilization, one operating on a level of industrial might and security that made their own war effort seem almost primitive. The darkness of Europe had met the blazing light of the New World, and the contrast was blinding. The next morning, the generals disembarked. As their polished leather boots stepped onto the pier, it was a symbolic moment. This was German military might, or what was left of it, setting foot on American soil for the first time. But not as conquerors as they had dreamed, but as prisoners. And the ground they stood on wasn't scarred by battle. There were no bomb craters, no rubble, no shell casings. The concrete was clean. The air didn't smell of smoke and decay. It smelled of sea salt and city life. As they were marched through the streets, they saw the people. Americans weren't gaunt and starving. They were well-dressed. They were smiling. Kids were playing. Life was normal. They saw newsstands overflowing with magazines, grocery stores packed with food, shiny new cars driving by. This wasn't a country on its knees. This was a country that was thriving. All the stories they had been told, all the propaganda they had believed, evaporated in the face of this overwhelming reality. The shock wasn't just visual. It was psychological. It was the complete and total dismantling of their entire worldview. Their war had been for nothing. They had sacrificed millions for a cause that was doomed from the start, not just by Allied armies, but by the sheer, untouchable power of the American home front. As they were loaded onto trains to be taken to prison camps deep within the country, they looked out the windows not as arrogant generals, but as defeated men who had just seen the future. And it wasn't theirs. Logistics of comfort. How ice cream reached the front lines. Let's start with the mess hall. For a German general in 1945, a meal back home was a grim affair. Strict rationing meant coarse, dark bread, ersatz coffee made from acorns, thin soups, and a sliver of meat, if you were lucky. The German war machine was running on fumes, and the civilian population was starving. Now picture that same general walking into an American POW camp dining hall. The first thing that hits him is the smell. Real coffee, brewing in enormous percolators. And not just one cup. The pots were bottomless. Then he sees the food line. Heaps of scrambled eggs, piles of bacon, sausages, and a mountain of something he hadn't seen in years. Pure white bread. Not the dense, dark rye of the fatherland, but fluffy, soft, white bread. Next to it, tubs of real, creamy, yellow butter and jars of sweet jam. For these men, butter was a luxury reserved for the highest officials in Berlin, a symbol of status. Here, it was being slathered onto bread by common prisoners, with no one batting an eye. One German officer, Franz von Wehre, famously noted his astonishment at the endless supply of food. But the generals, men who understood logistics and national economies, were truly floored. They saw not just a meal, but a profound statement of economic power. They started doing the mental math. To provide this much coffee, sugar, and flour to millions of its own soldiers, plus prisoners, meant America's supply chain was something beyond their comprehension. This wasn't a nation stretched to its limit. This was a nation barely flexing its muscles. A German admiral, reflecting on his first meal, reportedly just shook his head and said, "How can you defeat a country that has so much?" It was a question that echoed through the camps. The sheer quantity of meat was another paradox. These generals who had once feasted in Parisian restaurants during the early days of the war were now eating better as prisoners than they had as free commanders in the final years. They were served generous portions of beef, pork, and chicken daily. Back in Germany, their own soldiers were lucky to get a thin meat stew once a week. The irony was crushing. They were the defeated, yet they were being fed like victors. This economic shock wasn't just confined to the dinner plate. It was everywhere. They saw the American guards, the GIs. These weren't the weary, gaunt figures of the German army. The American soldiers were tall, healthy, and radiated vitality. Their teeth were perfect. They laughed easily. They weren't hardened by years of deprivation. To the German command, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about the decadent and soft Americans, this was a startling contradiction. These soft young men looked like they'd been raised on milk and steak their whole lives, because many of them had. The physical health of the average American soldier was a walking, talking testament to a standard of living that was simply unimaginable in war-torn Europe. And then there was the ultimate symbol of American logistical might, a symbol so absurd, so extravagant, it almost seemed like a joke: ice cream. The generals learned that the US Navy had commissioned a floating ice cream factory, a concrete barge that could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. This barge followed the fleet in the Pacific, churning out the frozen treat for sailors in the middle of a war zone. The U.S. Army Air Forces developed special containers to be attached to fighter planes, using the freezing high-altitude air to make ice cream for the pilots on their way back from a mission. Think about that. While Germany was struggling to produce basic ammunition, America had industrialized the process of delivering a frozen dessert to its frontline troops. It wasn't a necessity. It wasn't a weapon. It was a comfort. It was a morale booster. And it was a logistical feat that spoke volumes. If a nation could dedicate resources to making sure its soldiers in the middle of the Pacific had access to vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry, what other miracles of production was it capable of? To the German generals, this wasn't just decadence. It was a terrifying display of a production capacity so vast it could afford to be frivolous. This cultural shock did more to demoralize the German high command than any lecture or propaganda film could. They weren't just defeated on the battlefield. They were dwarfed by an economic reality they couldn't argue with. They saw that America wasn't just fighting a war. It was running a war while barely breaking a sweat. The white bread, the endless coffee, the healthy soldiers, and the frontline ice cream, it all painted a picture of a superpower whose resources were, for all practical purposes, infinite. When these generals were finally repatriated to a Germany in ruins, they carried this knowledge with them. The stories they told weren't just of battles lost, but of an abundance witnessed. It was a humbling, profound lesson. They had been beaten not just by soldiers and tanks, but by farmers, factory workers, and a system that could produce both guns and butter in unbelievable quantities. They had tried to conquer the world with military might, only to be defeated by a country that could make ice cream in the sky. It was a stark reminder that modern wars are won not just on the front lines, but also in the factories, on the farms, and in the mess halls. The endless horizon, traveling across a continent. Our story begins on a ship crossing the Atlantic. For these high-ranking officers who had only known the confines of Europe, the sheer vastness of the ocean was the first shock. But the real mind-bending experience started when they landed and were put on a train. Their destination? A POW camp deep in the American interior. This train journey wasn't just a simple transfer. It was an unintentional, devastating psychological weapon. As the train chugged along, day after day, the generals stared out the window. They crossed the Appalachian Mountains, rolled through the vast plains of the Midwest, and headed towards the Rockies. They kept waiting for the landscape to end, but it never did. An endless horizon of farmland, forests, and prairies stretched out before them. One German officer, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, a famed panzer commander who served under Rommel, later recalled his astonishment. He said they traveled for days and days, and all they saw was an endless expanse of land. In Germany, A train journey of that length would cross multiple countries. Here, they were still in the same nation. This wasn't just a country, it was a continent. The scale was incomprehensible. But it wasn't just the size of the country that was shocking. It was what they saw, or rather, what they didn't see. For years, these men had lived in a world of rubble and ruins. Allied bombers had relentlessly pounded German cities into dust. Every bridge, every factory, every railway line was a target. The landscape of their home was scarred with bomb craters and skeletal remains of buildings. But as they traveled for thousands of miles across America, they saw nothing of the sort. Not a single bomb crater, not one destroyed bridge. Every town they passed was pristine, with lights twinkling at night. The infrastructure was completely intact. This had a profound psychological impact. They were witnessing a country completely untouched by the devastation of war. While Germany was bleeding, America was whole. It was a nation at peace with itself, even while fighting a war on two fronts across the world. The generals who had been fed propaganda about a decadent, weak America on the brink of collapse were confronted with a reality that was the exact opposite. They were seeing a country so powerful and so protected by its geography that its enemies couldn't even touch its homeland. The psychological blow was immense. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a fortress. Then came the cities. As the train approached major urban centers like Chicago, another unbelievable sight greeted them: traffic jams. Not military convoys, but endless streams of private cars. In 1945, gasoline in Germany was so severely rationed that civilian cars were practically non-existent. Only the highest officials and the military could drive. The rest of the population walked, biked, or relied on war-damaged public transport. But in America, even in the midst of a world war, it seemed like every family owned a car. Streets were clogged with them. Parking lots were full. It was a level of consumer prosperity that was simply unimaginable back home. One general reportedly stared at a traffic jam for a long time, and then turned to his fellow prisoners and said, "How can we win this war?" He understood immediately. A nation that could afford to put millions of its citizens in private cars, while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of tanks, planes, and ships, was operating on a completely different level of industrial and economic power. It wasn't just a military conflict. It was a battle of production, and Germany had already lost. The evidence of this industrial might was everywhere. As they passed through industrial regions, the sky was filled with smoke. Not from burning cities, but from the smokestacks of countless factories, churning out war materials 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The German generals were experts in logistics and production. They knew what it took to supply an army. They could look at the sheer number of factories and understand the terrifying output they represented. Germany's industrial production, while impressive, had peaked and was now being systematically dismantled by Allied bombing. But here, they were seeing an industrial giant that was just getting warmed up. The United States had entered the war late, but its economic engine was so colossal that it could outproduce all of the Axis powers combined. The generals saw it with their own eyes, an endless chain of factories, smelters, and shipyards, all humming with activity, all completely safe from attack. It was the physical manifestation of President Roosevelt's promise to turn America into the arsenal of democracy. All of these experiences, the vastness of the land, the intact cities, the rivers of cars, the smoking factories, coalesced into one crushing realization. America was not just a country. It was a sleeping giant that had been fully awakened. The Nazi leadership had fatally underestimated its opponent. They had believed their own propaganda, thinking America was a soft, divided nation that would crumble under pressure. But the reality was a unified, resource-rich, and industrially unparalleled superpower. For these German generals, the train ride across America was more effective than any interrogation or propaganda leaflet. It was a silent, undeniable tour of their own defeat. They understood that Germany, no matter how brilliantly its soldiers fought or how innovative its weapons were, could never conquer a nation of this scale and power. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. When they finally arrived at their POW camps, they were changed men. The arrogance and confidence they might have had were replaced with a grim sense of finality. They knew the war was over. Lieutenant General Ferdinand Heim, another captured officer, summarized the feeling perfectly. He later wrote that the journey revealed to him the hopelessness of Germany's situation. This story is a powerful reminder that wars are not won by battlefield tactics alone. They are won by logistics, by industry, and by the sheer economic weight of nations. The German generals who thought they knew everything about warfare got their final, most brutal lesson not on the battlefield, but from the window of a passenger train, rolling peacefully through the heart of their enemy's homeland. Intellectual defeat, interrogations and admissions. The initial interrogations were often a battle of wits. These were proud, professional soldiers, steeped in a tradition of military honor. They weren't just going to spill state secrets. But the American interrogators, many of them German Jewish refugees who understood the culture perfectly, used a different approach. Instead of harsh methods, they often engaged the generals in conversations, treating them with a degree of professional respect that caught the Germans completely off guard. This led to some fascinating exchanges. When talking to their American counterparts, the German generals were struck by the casual, almost laid-back efficiency of the U.S. officers. The American military wasn't the rigid, hierarchical structure they were used to. Officers and enlisted men interacted with a level of familiarity that would be unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. Yet, this democratic army was undeniably effective. It was a contradiction they couldn't reconcile. It was their first clue that the propaganda they'd been fed was deeply, fundamentally wrong. One of the most common refrains heard from the captured generals was a variation of, "They told us you were collapsing." They had been led to believe that America was a society torn apart by racial tension, crippled by labor strikes, and too soft to fight a real war. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had painted a picture of a nation in its death throes. But the reality they encountered was the complete opposite. Their journey from the East Coast ports to the prison camps was a carefully orchestrated revelation. They traveled by train, and the blinds were intentionally left open. What they saw through those windows was a country not just functioning, but thriving. They saw endless fields of crops, bustling factories with smokestacks puffing day and night, and towns full of well-dressed, well-fed civilians. They saw roads packed with cars, not military vehicles, but private automobiles, a luxury reserved for the elite back in Germany. One general, after seeing the sheer number of cars in a parking lot outside a factory, reportedly turned to his guard and asked in disbelief if they all belonged to the workers. When the guard said yes, the general just shook his head. He knew then that Germany could not win the war. It wasn't a matter of fighting spirit or tactical genius. It was a simple, brutal equation of industrial might. This brings us to the math of logistics. As professional soldiers, these generals understood the importance of supply lines, production, and resources better than anyone. They had seen firsthand how the Eastern Front had bled the Wehrmacht dry. Now they were witnessing the source of the Allied deluge of material that had overwhelmed them. One general, Lieutenant General Ferdinand Heim, bluntly admitted it. He said, "The Americans are masters of material. We were masters of soldiers." Another, General von Choltitz, the last commander of Paris, later remarked that he knew the war was lost when he saw the sheer volume of supplies being landed on the Normandy beaches. It was, in his words, a spectacle of material wealth. They were forced to admit that American steel had ultimately triumphed over German willpower. But the most revealing insights came when the generals thought no one was listening. The Allies had bugged their quarters at Fort Hunt and other camps. Every room, every mess hall, every private space was wired with hidden microphones. The transcripts of these secret conversations, known as the Fort Hunt reports, are a treasure trove of unguarded thoughts. In private, the general's confident facade crumbled. They expressed awe and despair in equal measure. They talked about the endless freight trains they saw, laden with goods, and calculated the tonnage. They discussed the quality of the American soldiers' uniforms, their food, even their cigarettes. It was all superior to what their own men had. They spoke about the sheer scale of America, a continent-sized powerhouse that Germany, a medium-sized European nation, had foolishly challenged. These conversations revealed the death of a central Nazi myth, the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman. They had been told they were a master race, destined to rule over inferior peoples. But here, they were confronted with a nation of mongrels, as their own ideology termed it, that was outproducing, out-innovating, and out-fighting them on every level. The cognitive dissonance was immense. Some clung to their ideology, blaming failures on Hitler's blunders. But many others began to quietly accept the truth. They saw a system that, for all its perceived chaos, was more resilient, more powerful, and ultimately more successful than their own rigid totalitarian state. Generalmajor Otto Ernst Remer, a hardcore loyalist who helped crush the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, was stunned by the normalcy of American life. He saw no signs of rationing, no fear, no hint of a nation straining under the weight of a world war. It was just business as usual. For him and many others, this was the ultimate intellectual defeat. It wasn't a battle that was lost, but the entire premise of their war. They had gambled everything on a lie, and the quiet, undeniable prosperity of the American heartland was the proof. The story of the German POW generals in America is a powerful lesson in the clash between ideology and reality. It shows that wars are not just won on the battlefield with tactics and courage, but in the factories, on the farms, and in the minds of the people. The generals came to America expecting to find a weak and divided enemy. Instead, they found a sleeping giant, fully awakened, whose power was so vast and so casually displayed that it simply broke their spirit. They left not just as defeated soldiers, but as men whose entire understanding of the world had been turned upside down. The long shadow, post-war perspectives, and the new world. Their shock came during the journey itself. The sheer number of ships in the convoys, the endless stream of supplies heading to Europe, was a logistical marvel they had failed to comprehend. But the true astonishment began when they disembarked. Instead of war-torn streets, they saw bustling cities. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds in New York City. The ports were filled not with wreckage, but with commercial vessels peacefully loading and unloading goods. There were no signs of bombing, no food lines, no rationing visible to the naked eye. One of the most powerful moments for many was the train ride from the East Coast to prison camps in places like Mississippi, Texas, or Arizona. This cross-country journey became a rolling panorama of American prosperity. They stared out the windows for days, and what did they see? Endless fields of corn and wheat, vast herds of cattle, and countless factories churning out products day and night. The industrial might was overwhelming. Smoke billowed from stacks not because of bombs, but because of production. They saw towns and cities where life seemed to be proceeding as normal. People were driving cars, children were playing in parks, and store shelves were full. In his memoirs, one general, Ferdinand Heim, who was captured at Stalingrad, wrote about his train journey. He was stunned by the number of cars he saw parked outside factories and on the streets. In Germany, a car was a luxury reserved for the elite. Here, it seemed every worker owned one. He noted the sheer scale of everything: the bridges, the highways, the endless freight trains carrying raw materials and finished goods. He famously remarked to a fellow officer that if what they were seeing on this train ride was real, Germany never stood a chance. It wasn't a matter of fighting spirit or tactics. It was a simple, brutal equation of industrial capacity. Another general, Gotthard Heinrici, kept a detailed diary. He described the shock of the undamaged. He wrote about seeing grocery stores overflowing with food, something unthinkable back home. He watched civilians enjoying a standard of living that seemed like a fantasy. This wasn't a nation on its knees from a long war. This was a superpower that was just getting started. The realization dawned on them that America was fighting the war with only a fraction of its total economic power, while Germany had thrown everything it had into the conflict and was collapsing. This profound experience had a lasting impact. These generals, who were supposed to be the strategic masterminds of the Third Reich, finally understood the true source of Allied power. It wasn't just about soldiers and tanks on the battlefield. It was about the unshakable foundation of industry, agriculture, and geography. America's distance from the front lines, protected by two vast oceans, allowed its industrial heartland to operate untouched. While German factories were being relentlessly bombed, American factories were not only safe, but were accelerating production to unprecedented levels. For many of these men, the experience in America was a lesson in humility. They saw firsthand a different model of society, a consumer economy driven by mass production. The sheer abundance was a strategic weapon more powerful than any V-2 rocket. They realized that their leadership had fatally underestimated the United States. Hitler had dismissed America as a mongrel society incapable of fighting effectively. The generals now saw that this was a catastrophic miscalculation. After the war, when these generals were repatriated, they returned to a Germany in ruins. The contrast was even more stark. They had seen the future, and it was the American model of mass production and consumerism. Many of them, in their post-war writings and interviews, stressed this point. They argued that Germany's path to recovery lay not in militarism, but in rebuilding its industry and economy, drawing lessons from what they had witnessed in the States. Men like Franz Halder, former chief of the Army General Staff, went on to work with American military historians after the war, his perspective profoundly shaped by his time as a POW. Their shock was more than just a passing moment of awe. It was a fundamental shift in their understanding of modern warfare and global power. It revealed that wars in the 20th century were not just won by brilliant generals or brave soldiers, but by nations with the deepest pockets, the most productive factories, and the most resilient economies. The sight of America's untouched prosperity was the final, undeniable proof that the war had been lost long before the last battle was fought. The story of these German generals serves as a powerful reminder of how insulated a nation can be from the true nature of its adversaries. They lived in an echo chamber of their own propaganda, and the reality of America's strength was a truth they could only grasp when they saw it with their own eyes. It was a strategic lesson written not in military textbooks, but across the vast, thriving landscape of the United States. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I did, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you might not have heard before. See you in the next video.